Good evening, everyone. There we go. My name is Miriam Pura, and I am the chair of the Friends of the Loyola University Libraries Board. It's my pleasure to welcome you all today on behalf of Dean Marianne Ryan, who can't be here with us, but she sends her best regards. I hope you will allow me a little bit of time for some special acknowledgements before we welcome our speaker and get started with this evening's program. This week, as many of you know, and there's some set up in the back, is National Library Week, which is a time to celebrate our nation's libraries and library workers' contributions, as well as to promote library use and support. I want to especially thank our friends of the libraries who support our vision to be Loyola's gateway to the world of information and scholarship through in-kind support and financial gifts. In particular, I would like to call out two instrumental people who are here today, Dr. Peter Gilmore and Stephen Tetra. If we could give them a small round of applause. Many of you may know Dr. Gilmore is Professor Emeritus of Loyola's Institute of Pastoral Studies. Thanks to Peter's vision, thanks to Peter's vision years ago, as a labor of love, this is really his brainchild, he conceived the Alumni Authors Project, which is a comprehensive catalog of books authored by Loyola alumni. Last October, we unveiled the Alumni Authors Collection, which is located downstairs in the building's first floor and is also displayed at our Water Tower campus's Lewis Library. You can browse and check out more than 1,100 books. Thanks also to the hard work of our librarians and our staff who organized the collection. I also want to acknowledge our friend Stephen Tetra, a painter, illustrator, and musician who was appointed as artist in residence at Loyola's Cuneo Mansion. He gifted the university libraries with the official Alumni Authors Collection artwork. I think it's on screen potentially. It was earlier, but it's also on the display in the back. And if you, on your way out from tonight's program, if you check out the alumni collection, you will see the artwork over the bookshelves. Stephen's artwork is prominently displayed on the collection's bookshelf on the first floor, and our sincere thanks to all of you who are involved with this special project. Tonight's Alumni Authors Speaker Series is one of the many ways the university libraries facilitate the academic pursuits and cultural enrichment of Loyola and our community. Thanks to all of our donors who provide financial support that enables us to sponsor events, acquire books and other resources, support digital initiatives, enhance facilities, and support professional development for our staff. The university libraries needs this type of support to continue offering user-focused services and programs for the Loyola community and the nearby neighborhoods. If you would like to learn more about how to support us and how to get involved, please visit our website, libraries.luc.edu. Before I introduce our speaker, because I know that's who we're all here to see, I would like to acknowledge our university library staff, many of whom are floating in the back, and the Alumni Relations Department here at Loyola for their support. In particular, thanks to the advancement team for supporting our refreshments for the evening. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. After his talk, we will have time for Q&A, and he will also stay for a book signing, which will be over here on this side table. Stuart Dybek received both a BS and an MA in English from Loyola University Chicago and an MFA from the University of Iowa's Writers' Workshop. He is the author of 6 critically acclaimed books of fiction, including The Coast of Chicago, which was one book Chicago selection. I remember reading it then, and 2 collections of poetry. His work has been widely anthologized, translated into several languages, and published in magazines such as The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and Harpers, and in both Best American Poetry and Best American Fiction. Dybek has been the recipient of numerous honorary degrees and literary recognitions. These include Guggenheim, MacArthur Foundation, and NEA fellowships, the Pen Malamud Prize, and the American Academy of Arts, and the Harold Washington Literary Awards. Dybek grew up in Chicago's Pilsen and Little Village neighborhoods, which have served as settings for both his fiction and poetry, as has Loyola. Please let's welcome Stuart with a warm up.
Well, can you guys hear me?
Sure, turn it on.
Oh. How's this? Good. Since Peter Gilmore's name is being bandied about here, I am going to dedicate this reading to him. He's an old friend, and I think what he's done about that archive has just been spectacular. It's just so important when a university recognizes that something like that is important, and it's a two-way street. Having the archive is also elevates the university. It's called The Collection, and one of my favorite historians who wrote a book called Sapiens points out that the thing that separates human beings from other forms of life is that language permits them to work as a collective, that the evolution of human culture is all about collectives. And so when somebody creates an archive like that, that's exactly what's going on. I had a danger for me, I knew was going to be that there were so many things I could talk about that I didn't want to end up just kind of rambling from one to the other. And so I actually sat down and did something I don't do very often, which was I wrote a little, I wouldn't glorify it by calling it a talk. And I wrote it in Florida a couple of days ago and then got on a plane, ridiculously put it in my luggage, which I haven't seen since. So I am going to kind of talk off the cuff. And also we talked about the question and answer afterwards, but honestly, you won't be disrupting anything. If you feel like just saying, well, how about this or that? I'd be happy to make it more of a conversation if the spirit moves you at all. The other danger, besides my rambling around, is that I don't want to be nostalgic in any way, which would be very easy for me because the university here was so hugely important. But what I'd rather do is maybe talk about the past in a way that hopefully is still applicable to the present. After all, if you're talking about telling stories, writing, trying to write literature, the art of writing, and so on and so forth, it really ages. It doesn't age all that quickly. One of the things I wanted to say is that the German word for writing about education is Bildungsroman. And so many books that we treasure, Huckleberry Finn, are that indeed. And a lot of what I write is exactly that. And so writing about my time at Loyola, and not just Loyola, but the neighborhood surrounding Loyola. Because one of the things about writing about universities is one seldom writes about a university without writing about its surroundings. You can't really think about Salt Bellow without thinking of Hyde Park, for instance, and so on and so forth. So what I thought I would do would be start off by reading a little bit about some of the stuff I've written in which Loyola figures directly. I'm not going to read a whole story, but I thought I could try to give you the flavor. This is about 3 pages from a story called Sage. And it's in a book called Paper Lantern. The SAIS warning is in effect. Both the Chicago Tribune and the Evening News featured accounts of a killer SAIS of June 26, 1954, when a wave 10 feet high and 25 miles wide rose from a placid Lake Michigan and swept 7 fishermen off a breakwater at Montrose Harbor to their deaths. Atmospheric conditions were right for another. Were the beaches closed? I'm no longer sure. In memory, Lakeshore Drive is empty, barred to traffic as if awaiting a tsunami. I imagine the Seiche was like a towering wave from a Hiroshige print, all the more menacing for its froth of moon glow suspended for a heartbeat before dashing against the night-lit skyline. I didn't want to miss it. When I considered a vantage point, what came to mind was a single-story utility shed in the shadow of Madonna della Strada, the Art Deco Cathedral on Lakeshore campus of Loyola University. I'd attended Loyola on a track scholarship. Now I was a caseworker for Cook County Department of Public Aid. My district was Bronzeville on the south side, not far from the barrio I grew up in. I was living on the north side in Rogers Park, the neighborhood surrounding the university. And on nights when I couldn't sleep, I'd taken to going back to campus to run as if I were still training for races. Lately, that was most nights. I'd never had insomnia before and worried if the job was getting to me. I dug out my old track shoes. A potholed, obsolete cinder track circled a soccer field. I set up the hurdles. I found toppled together in the nearly obliterated broad jump pit and ran imaginary heats until my shirt was pasted to my back by sweat and I gasped for breath. Then, to the tick-tock of crickets and lawn sprinklers, I jogged from campus along front yards, hurdling hedges and fences along the darkened residential blocks to the deserted beach at the end of Columbia Avenue. I stripped down to my jockstrap, draped my shoes and shorts and t-shirt that would later serve as a towel over the crossbar of a lifeguard chair and waded out. A moonlit sandbar sloped gradually deeper. Underfoot, the sand had assumed the undulation of waves. Waist deep, I slid into the cool night water and swam from the city without looking back until I was out far enough to imagine I had crossed the boundary of a wake left behind long ago by a priest I once watched swim. At least people said he was a priest. I watched his implacable crawl during the summer after my senior year, confused, solitary time. In the space of a few months before graduation, I'd become more involved than I realized with an exchange student who had returned suddenly to Beirut to attend the funeral of her grandfather. She'd been in the States only since the start of the academic year. Her name was Nisa. We'd met during the winter semester in a poetry class. The first assignment for each student was to memorize and recite a favorite poem. Howl was too long, so I chose Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. At 131 lines, it took 5 minutes to disclaim. When it was Nisa's turn, she rose from her seat with her tangle of black hair pouring down her back, and in a clear voice recited, I want to be where your bare foot walks, because maybe before you step, you look at the ground. I want that blessing. Then she quickly sat back down. Her recitation had lasted moments. She didn't say who'd written the poem. No one inquired. I'd never heard a poem like that, a poem direct and sensual. And it occurred to me that perhaps she'd written it. I was too shy to admit it. I didn't ask in class for fear of embarrassing her, but I wanted to hear the poem again, to copy it down and read more like it. After class, I caught up with her and asked who wrote it. Rumi, she said. Who? Rumi was hardly known in America then. though years later he'd become a New Age bestseller. Rumi, he wrote in Persian in the 13th century. He was a Sufi and ecstatic. Mind if I walk along with you, I asked. Let us go then, you and I, she said in a portentous voice, mimicking my recital of proof. We walked to the library. Here we are. It's actually that one. I said no nostalgia. Where was I? Oh, yeah. We walked to the library and she helped me find an anthology of Persian poetry. Until reading about Sufi mysticism in the introduction, I hadn't realized that the poem Nisa had recited was a prayer to God rather than a sensual love poem I'd taken it to be. I decided not to mention my disappointment. Her family was Maronite Christian, although I had some vague notion of Maronites, that they were connected to Greek Orthodox. I was ignorant as to how they differed from Catholics. So what happens is he gets involved with this girl, the eye in the story, and then she goes off, and it's before computers and cell phones, and she just disappears, and he has no way of getting in touch with her, even though she's promised to stay in touch. He doesn't know if something terrible has happened in Beirut, or if just once she's left America, everything that he thinks was going on between them seems like a dream to her or a mistake. But what I want to do is talk a little bit about when you're writing, estimating what your gifts are. And a guy in the story runs track, and you know, when you find out that you're faster than the other kids, you suddenly realize you've got a gift. It's up to you if you want to see if you can make it the best you can and win some races and whatever. With writing or music or any of the arts, you kind of find out along the line if you do or if you don't, which doesn't mean that you'll succeed or not. It just means that it might be a direction that you'll be interested in moving in. But besides those kinds of natural gifts that you can take no credit for, you can take credit for working with them, but you can take no credit whatsoever for having them, are these other kinds of gifts. What your family was like, where you grew up, and your university. And it seems to me in retrospect that one of the things I wanted to talk about was what gift or gifts did Loyola offer. And one of them, I think, for me at least, was the gift that it gave one a language, a sacred language. Whether you shared that belief in the sacredness or not is another question. But the fact that you have the language to express awe, wonder, mystery, that vocabulary, that mythology, that it's become second nature to you, is tremendously important. And you can in fact play one of the more interesting literary games, which the blues does, for instance, with church music in Black storefront churches. And that's that you can play with that dichotomy between the sacred and the profane. And that you can have a literary career based on that one dichotomy. So what I wanted to do was read, apart from this story, I mentioned that priest. A lot of this stuff I made up, by the way, this is fiction. But there was this. It's always a kind of a question at Q&A sometimes. I probably discouraged it now. Where people say, did that really happen? I can't tell you that. Of course, the guy I mentioned earlier about talking about when I was lauding Peter, talking about collections and the collective of humanity, Harari would say, nothing that's written exists. We made it all up. Every bit of it. A tree exists. Justice doesn't exist. We made that up. So here's the priest part. The priest swam each morning that summer. That I should add one last thing. So it's the summer this guy's suffering. And I'll add to that, maybe behind it, although it's not in the story at all, is the idea that I think for undergraduates, this is really important. You get so much support at a good university, and then you graduate, and suddenly you're in this netherworld. You're not writing is such a, especially for writing, it's such an unbelievably deceptive art. By the time when you're just starting, people are already having grand rock and roll careers. Classical pianists have been playing since they were 5. And to give you an idea of what's realistic about writing is one of the most premier awards in poetry that still remains one of the premier awards in poetry, the Yale Younger Poets Contest. You know what the cutoff age is? 40. It's realistic. That's how old you're still a young poet at 40. Baryshnikov is done. He's over. And you're just, you're so so when you get out of college, because there are so many arts that the expectation is 25, 26, 27, you've got it made. There are really not a lot of 24, 25, 26, 27-year-old novelists. And so there's this interim period between undergrad and maybe having the support later where your stories start to get published, your poems start to get published. Maybe you've got a novel published around 28, 29. But what are you doing when you're 24 and 25 and 26? One thing to really remember is that a totally misunderstood part of undergraduate life is your peer group. It's just never written about how important that is. And you really want to pour everything you can as an undergraduate into making strong peer group connections, because those are the people that are going to keep you going in that interim period. Anyway, so he's just entering that interim period. His heart's broken. And he's wondering what's happened. And here is, I think, something that, a gift of material, the swimming priest. The priest swam each morning that summer, far out beyond the whistles of lifeguards, reflecting light like white marble. His arms milled a steady stroke south toward the hazy skyline of downtown. I assumed he launched his swim from the tiny pebble beach near Madonna della Strada. I don't know how far he swam. I never saw him returning. I wondered if swimming for him was a form of prayer, a daily routine akin to that of the priests murmuring their breviaries as they stroll through the lakeside campus at dusk, He continued to swim after Labor Day, when the lifeguards left and the beaches officially closed. He swam through early autumn as the temperature fell and leaves rusted and rattled, and windy days stropped the waves to a metallic glint. Fall mornings when the surface of the lake steamed, I'd spot him always the same distance from shore, like a man trailing to swim the channel. There were overcast days when the sudsy gray chop made him hard to see. I test with my hand and imagine immersing my body into water that glacial. I began to wonder if rather than a prayer, swimming was a penance, some form of mortification, like a monk lashing himself in his cell, or Raskolnikov embracing suffering at the end of crime and punishment. What was he swimming from? I tried to imagine his demons without accusing him of a specific crime: molester, murderer, skimmer of donations on church-sponsored bingo nights. I supposed if there was a sin that had become his secret, that it must have been some betrayal of his office or vocation, a breach of trust that redefined him. By late October, there were morning frosts and days you could see your breath when it was too blustery to walk for long beside the lake. I don't know on what day he either found forgiveness or simply admitted it was impossible for him to enter the water. Swimming would never be my prayer, but now years later, breaststroking away from Columbia Beach at night, I hope that, like a kind of meditation, the swim would still my mind. So that's one story that a part of one story, and but there are others. Some are actually more neighborhood stories, but the neighborhood is so connected with Loyola that I never was really exactly sure where one would begin and the other would end. Going back to that notion of making things up, Peter and I shared the acquaintance of a wonderful teacher whose reason to be, in a way, was to teach Moby Dick. And he lived on a street called Farwell. And so I wrote a piece about him on Farwell. And some of it's true. He you know where the tennis court is on Farwell? He lived overlooking that tennis court so he could see the lake. But in the story, I merged him with other male figures in my life. So there was also in Rogers Park at that time, the Communist bookstore. It had been driven to Rogers Park because it had been bombed near LU downtown. And that was being run by a guy named Lou Diskin, who had fought in the, what was the battalion called in the Spanish Civil War that the Americans, Abraham Lincoln Brigade. And I mean, those guys were mauled. Lou survived, and he came and he opened up that little bookstore, which did a really good business on all the FBI guys in there who were buying books about being communists, asking them to speak into the microphone. So the guy in Farwell became Lou Diskin and another guy that I knew through my Polish relatives who had escaped Poland and then fought with the Brits through the rest of World War II. So you could just make these mergers. But the house on Farwell is all the same. And in the story, the guy teaches at Loyola. In another story, Loyola's right in the title. It's called Lunch at the Loyola Arms. And I don't know if any of you worked your way through college or felt so guilty about your parents having to cough up money that you had all these plans for the cheapest way you could possibly go to college. But that, I'll read you just a tiny little part of that. That went, are you any of you guys familiar with behind the L, the Loyola L? There's that funny little curving street. It's got a church. It looks like something that could have been out of, how do you pronounce it? The Chirico? The Chirico? The Chirico. It looks like it just was sitting there waiting for him to make a painting on that street. And that's where the Loyola Arms absolutely was. But my favorite thing about the story was just the title, Lunch at the Loyola Arms. The guy eats on the windowsill because he doesn't have a table. My plan was to live on Cheerios and baked potatoes. How much money did one really need after all? Supermarkets offered free samples and bruised fruit. There were books and records and libraries, paper and pen and banks, toilet paper and paper towels in public restrooms, soap and socks left in laundromats. There was army surplus, goodwill. It was September in America, days hazed in gold, streets lined with the largest of produce stands and flower stalls. The city, to quote, stash my buddy, loaded with bargains at the world's expense. In this country, he said, what amounts to merely surviving off crumbs would be a life of privilege most anywhere else on earth. But my lunches were becoming extravagant. Picnics on a windowsill, brunch water, Jewish rye, mayonnaise, raw onion, potato salad, blushing paprika, a cold beer, an enormous garlicky sea green pickle tongued just minutes before at the corner deli by a young woman with high cheekbones and a Slavic accent, her golden hair stranding from turquoise combs that would hardly contain the weight of curls, ample breasts so loose they had to be bare in the sleeveless blue sundress she wore, and the blonde hair growing profusely under her arms, flashing as she dipped into a huge glass crack where a school of kosher pickles darted away and tried to hide amidst the dillweed, roiled seeds, and wheeling peppercorns. Did she realize, looking at me as she seized the pickle, raising it victoriously, smiled, that there are times in a life, in the flash of natural humble hair beneath a woman's arms, and seemed like a forbidden glimpse, a promise of further mystery. So this is an undergraduate story. Just that first kind of blast of freedom when you're not living at home with mom and dad anymore, and there you are at Loyola University. Yeah, sure, you know. Anyway, the idea was that I was going to talk a half hour, and then we do Q&A for 20 minutes. And since nobody wanted to have a conversation up to this point, I'd be happy to try to have one now. Any questions?
We have a microphone also, so we can all hear you.
Okay.
No. Yeah, that's a quick question. Where was that bookstore located?
Which one?
The copyist bookstore, because I don't remember.
It was on Sheridan Road. I'll go on. Oh, you know what? Geez, I just remember I was going to tell you guys a story about a duck. Oh, another time. It's kind of, well, I'll tell it quickly, but the communist bookstore was located around the movie theater, around the 400. Yeah. And Lou got word that he was going to get bombed again. And a bunch of us moved it in the dead of night to an antique store. We moved the entire stock to an antique store on Wells Street. The antique store was named Obscurity and a Penny, which had been a literary magazine started here at Loyola. But it was, and he never reopened it. So, well, you want to hear the duck story?
Yes.
So, in the other story, Columbia's mentioned, and I was living right on Columbia. And it was a very, very cold winter. I was working as a caseworker and taking classes at Loyola at night for grad degree. And I was taking a class on a Saturday morning in Chaucer. And I had a friend from the hood, Pilsen, who was my drinking buddy. And on this particular night, we really overdid it. I did wake up late for that Chaucer class. And I kind of felt I had already not been a very impressive student for the Jesuit who was teaching the class. And the lake was frozen. And so it was a lot faster to run down that frozen lake than it was to go all the way to, and so I'm running down the lake, and I forgot to tell you one important thing. The only thing that one side of the family brought from Poland, no pictures, nothing about who the family would be, nothing. They brought a Przyna. Anybody know what a Przyna is? All right. So Przyna is a feather tick. It's made out of duck feathers. It's the warmest, most wonderful thing. It's like you have the lightness on you, and yet it's so unbelievably warm. And for some reason, I don't know why, maybe because I was the firstborn in a huge family, I got the Przyna. And it made me feel like I knew what a duck felt. I always just had this love of ducks, because this is what a duck feels like. No wonder they can swim in the cold. And so I'm running down and there's big holes in the ice. And I look in one of the holes, and there's a duck floating dead. But it's a kind of a duck I've never seen before. It's all black. It's got a little yellow bill, small. And I'm wearing these big kind of boots. So I reach a boot in there and I tow him out so I could look at him, even though I'm late for this Chaucer class. And as soon as he's out of that mush of ice, he moves. And I think, God, I got to run him back. No, I can't. So I put him in my book bag. And I run the class, and I get in the class, and I'm going to write, I keep saying I'm going to write this story, but I'm going to get in the class. But see, I mean, this is Loyola. I mean, just what a gift. And it's in Dumbach, but it's in a room where there's radiators all along the wall. And I get in as quietly as I can, and I slip the book bag under a radiator. And it's a time in American fashion when I mean leggings are back now, have been back. I mean, there's all these studies about how much money is spent on leggings, but all the women are wearing leggings, and it's also the time of mini skirts. So during the winter, the mini skirts are made of wool, and then there's leggings, and the third part of the look is something called chuckaboos. They're kind of go up to the ankle, And every girl in that class, every woman in that class is wearing that, has that look going. And we're doing the partners too. Maybe my favorite thing out of all of the Chaucer stuff. And suddenly, like a flamethrower, a streak of green fires over a couple of aisles like a flamethrower. I mean, I don't know how a duck could do a thing like this. And splatters upon leggings. Nobody knows what it is. This poor woman leaps up screaming. And everybody's screaming, and she's, what happened to me? What is this? What is this? And suddenly the duck is quacking. And the priest, the Jesuit, the teacher says, who brought that duck to life? And you have to raise your hand. Please take that duck and leave. So there's one that hasn't been written yet. There's a lot more to it, actually. I had it all through the winter. I would go out every so often and throw it up in the air. It lived in my bathtub. I'd come home from work and casework, and the duck would be floating around in there. And when I had people over, you know, men and women, I would have to explain, if you're going to use the reactor, there's a duck in the bathtub. It wouldn't eat, but it kept pooping. Did that. And I didn't have a car. I finally got a taxi cab, and I took it to Lincoln Park Zoo and dedicated and gave it to them. They took it. They had that big bird thing. It was a rare duck that had flown out of its range, which is what I figured. Never seen a duck like that. And I still have the paper that they gave me. Thank you for your donation of one duck. That's my duck story. Any other questions? Yeah.
Hey, I teach creative writing here. I just started 2 years ago. I wanted to ask you, well, I would love to know if there's any creative writing exercise that one of your teachers gave you that you still remember.
No, I did one time that was NPR did, which had been a writing exercise, but not a class I had been in. And it was that they gave us all an image. It was a wedding cake in the middle of the road, which later became an anthology. First, and then everybody had to write it. I think they picked 4 writers, and they read it. And it was so popular that then at Random House, somebody, I don't remember who, then gave that another, that was the same one. And maybe 50 writers each wrote a piece around that thing. So that, that's one kind of and the exercise it came from was a girl in a green raincoat. And Lucas, the photographer who works there, went to Wisconsin, and the woman taught at Wisconsin who was the girl in the green raincoat things. But I have one that I've used for many years. When I was at Iowa, going back to peer group. You know, when somebody enters a creative writing program, it just makes sense that you're going to look and see who the teachers are. But I honestly think it's more important to the vast majority of writers, not who they studied with, but who was sitting next to them. And I was sitting next to a guy named John O'Brien, who is deceased. But he came in one day with a story called Birds that just took the top of my head off. And I then started using it in all my classes. And it's the only exercise I've ever given where almost always at least one student has written from it a publishable story. But other than that, there are many ingenious ones.
Hi, clearly Loyola had a big impact on you and you're inspired by Loyola. Do you have anything else that inspired your writing? And can you walk us through like your writing process? So like, what does a typical day look like? Or if there is such a thing, what is your writing process?
Well, the main one is music. If you got to pick, I would have picked music. And big stereos and gazillions of things, and I write to music. The thing I love about it is it gives me ideas when I listen to it that I wouldn't have if I wasn't listening. The effect it has on me, and I think everybody's wired differently in this regard. But I'm so attuned to mood, and that's always the music I'm so I have a story called Chopin and Wind. In fact, this entire book is an homage to music. Every story has music in it. You would read it and you would never necessarily see that. I Sailed with Magellan happens to be a song that's sung in one of the stories. The first story is called Song. And so you can broaden that notion, if it's not music for one, it's art or photography or film, that another art that doesn't work on words, I think is invaluable for because the thing is that when it isn't, I have a friend, a poet named Michael Ryan, who talks about writers and reading and that relationship, which is so bound up that it's hard to distinguish where one stops and the other begins. And reading itself is a great art. All the other arts come to us through the senses. And in that regard, it makes us not passive. I don't mean that we're passive. They energize us, they educate us. But they don't demand from us what reading demands. If you turn around in a movie theater, you just see the mass dream that you're all sharing. I mean, and immediately you turn away from it, it's scary. And certainly to sit in front of a great painting or any kind of painting that moves you is a deeply emotional experience. The same thing with listening to music. But it's not demanding the same thing from you that reading is. Up until the time of gamers, only dance was as interactive as an art as reading. And I mean, I really think that there are great readers. That is their art. And but what Michael Ryan would say that writers read carnivorously. They're always looking for something to beg, borrow, or steal. And And so, you know, reading is this incredibly important thing. But the one side to it that's a little bit dangerous is that when you have a favorite writer, he can get in, or she can get inside you. And when you're looking at a different art form, that's far less likely to happen. Writers, T.S. Eliot, I mentioned proofread. You know, many writers said what I just said. This is an homage to music, or this is that. Eliot's got 4 quartets. You cannot copy music in writing. You can try to pretend you are. You can't do it. It's not possible. So you can, you know, if you're a poet and you're tremendously moved by 4 quartets, you can end up trying to copy T.S. Eliot. But T.S. Eliot can't copy Beethoven. And so that fact that another art form can be really important to you as a writer comes with that advantage, that you're not sounding like somebody else. You're sounding like yourself with that art flowing through you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for speaking first. You began this talk by saying that you're going to avoid being nostalgic. And then you said that, you began talking about nostalgia, and you also said that an important lesson that you learned is accounting for or estimating your gifts. And what strikes me as really true is that one of your greatest gifts and what makes you such an inspiring writer to me is that you capture a certain texture of nostalgia that I struggle to encounter elsewhere. And I think what I mean by that is that you balance really well, and what you just said today is evidence of this. You balance really well the preciousness and the particularity of a memory with the sort of anxiety and fear of that memory sort of fading away and not being what it once was. And I see that in pet milk, in the swirling of milk and coffee, or in this sort of foam on the lake at night. And so I guess I want, as a fiction writer, to ask you about how much effort goes into sort of preserving that balance, or if it is sort of nature or yeah, because I think as a fiction writer, my greatest anxiety is wanting to sort of capture the truth and the sort of preciousness of the moment, but the difficulty of that moment sort of not being. And I think this gets true and true as I sort of approach my theories.
So thanks for the generous words. And if I can boil the question down to, if memory is your theme, how can you keep it alive without sentimentalizing it into nostalgia? And it starts out with admitting to yourself that every good subject worth doing is going to have a challenge of some kind. Let's say your subject is violence, or your subject is sexuality. You know, those 2 subjects just come loaded with, that doesn't mean that you don't write about them. Of course that's ridiculous that you would, that's not a solution. So, and memory and nostalgia, of course, are not the same thing at all. I also will throw in there that it's true to, we still have enough Anglo-Saxon in American culture that I think that is a little harder on nostalgia than in Gabriel Garcia Marquez. You have characters walking around saying, "Oh, my nostalgia." It's just part of, yeah. I remember I did this thing one time, and we were all in France at some literary conference, and a bunch of guys from Cuba were there, giving me wide berth, I might add, and I mean, they had just these wonderful stories, but they were deeply nostalgic. And I realized as I listened to them that they just didn't have these same kinds of attitudes in Cuba about what they were doing. I'm just trying to think of, it's such an interesting question. The thing about memory that really fascinates me with writing is that to write it isn't to have it, but to try to get it on the page uses aspects of memory that are tremendously powerful as craft elements. So one thing about memory is it's hugely compressive. The way you have it, it can ramble on. The closeness of memory and dream fascinates me because they're both based on image and they're both based on associative thinking. They're not narrative. Memory can be narrative, but it's not necessarily narrative. It can be imagistic. It is so, I mean, when you think about memory, of all the gazillion things that could be your memory, and the few that you have, how selective it is. And of course, we all know that it's absolutely undependable, which means that as you have it, imagination is already busting its way in, which is exactly what you want as a writer. You want that relationship between what you think you remember and to recreate it on the page. So, I mean, I just named a quick list of things, but every one of those things is absolutely critical to writing. And that brings up the subject of flashback, which a very good Irish writer has been speaking against. And my dear friend Alan Shoes, maybe some of you remember him. He used to have a wonderful show on NPR. He was killed in an automobile crash, but just a great guy. But we used to have just these, we used to do readings together where we'd have arguments about flashback. He'd say how absolutely phony it is, and so on and so forth. And I would argue that writing is one of the few arts that actually permits for it. Unless you're a total Fellini or a auteur in film, it's absolutely cheesy. But writing, it just seems like it fits. Oh, actually, exercise is to have somebody who has just visited a friend or relative in the hospital and has gone outside and sat on a park bench. What does he or she flashback on? And because it's this making that link between the present and a challenging present and how the mind reacts to it. But so all those things I hope are in some way an answer to your question. The what you want to do as you're writing memory is you really as a writer want to feel that it's coming to life on the page. You're not using the fact that it's a memory to in any way say, I don't have, you have to bring it to more life. Yes.
Want to. I'm glad that you lost your speech in a way, because I feel like some of these stories wouldn't have come up if they're awesome. And I was struck by the story of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade fighter, you know,
Mhm.
so like, essentially someone who volunteered to fight fascism, right? And came back to the United States
Mhm.
and wanted to run a bookstore.
Mhm.
Bookstore gets bombed.
Mhm.
He gets essentially harassed by the FBI.
Yeah, it blew out his window. Nobody got hurt, but it scared him.
Yeah. What happened to him? And can you repeat his name?
Lou Diskin. And I've gone to look him up any number of times. When I taught in the Caribbean, there was a wonderful couple, a man and a woman, Caribbean American. And they had this study group that I wanted to be part of. They had both lost their jobs because of House of Un-American Activities. And when they found out that I knew Lou Diskin, I was in. People knew who he was. It was long before woke. So long before woke. And I figured I had a right to tell a Polish joke. Polish. What a crazy idea, right? And Lou said, "That's not funny." I said, "What do you mean? It's pretty hilarious." I tell you, except I don't want to. And he said that's an attack on the people. And I walked out of there thinking, God, I mean, cliches, communist cliches. The more I thought about it, man, that guy is really right. He is so right. You know, but he's an amazing man. But the one thing he never really was able to solve was Stalin. His answer to Stalin was, well, if we had something like socialism or communism in America, it would be American. Yeah, but what about? So I don't want to, make a saint out of him, but he was somebody to learn from, that's for sure. Any other questions? Yes.
In terms of Chicago as a character,
In terms of Chicago as a character, what do you think the city has to offer?
As the character of Chicago? Well, it's a city of neighborhoods. And once you say that, then you can boil it down to what the various, what does Chicago have to offer as a city was the question. So if you look at the different writers who've written about Chicago, and there are a lot of them, if you're not from the city, you just say, she's a Chicago writer, Sandra Cisneros. He's a Chicago writer, Saul Bellow, Nelson Algren, etc. Well, if you're from the city, you realize that every one of those writers has a neighborhood. And then really a far more accurate appraisal of the writer is talking about the writer in terms of that neighborhood. James Farrell, and a lot of it has to do with ethnic, race, and because it does, that's the gift. Again, I'm back to the gift, but the thing is that, so I've got Pilsen and Little Village. When I grew up, I mean, I had no idea what their history was. One of the things I love about today is that almost every school now has a Chicago history program that a kid can take, and you begin to understand where you fit in. But I mean, for a while I was a caseworker in Bronzeville, and Gwendolyn Brooks was one of my favorite writers ever. And I just didn't tie the two of them together. But Is she only a writer about Bronzeville? Of course, that would be absolute nonsense. The idea is that when the eternal is in the temporary. The universal is in the particular. Every writer knows that. And so when you have your neighborhood, if you can put all your energy into your neighborhood, so Little Village, Pilsen, that's about assimilation. It's about the American dream. It's about how does democracy work in relationship to capitalism when you're living in a working class neighborhood. It's about the different kinds of ethnicity. It's about watching one ethnicity change into another. I mean, I watched a Slavic neighborhood change into a place that was really good to eat. And all those great themes. And you know, and if you sat down and sometimes you see this in undergrads, I'm not dissing them, that they sit down with a theme. They're going to write this great theme. It's about the worst way in the world you could ever go about writing something with a theme to it. The theme has to rise from the material, not, and in fact, that is, I'm the only thing I could think about maybe saying about woke is that sometimes woke is coming from the top down. But, you know, and no other gripes, believe me. But in writing, that's a dangerous thing. You want it to come from the material itself. And that's the thing when you're writing the Chicago neighborhood stories, that's exactly what's happening. The different characters that you're making come to not symbolize exactly, but represent certain kinds of characters that are under certain kinds of pressure and been formed by certain kinds of background things. But they're still absolute human beings. They're funny, they're sensual, they're not black or white in terms of morality. They're complicated. So I don't think Chicago is, of course, has, you know, all urban writing has that, but Chicago really has it because the neighborhoods are much intact. Still, I sometimes would go through what's that neighborhood on Argyle that has a name. Yeah, but I mean, when it was like, I think people, Young Lee still lives over there, wonderful Chinese poet, Chinese American poet. But I'd watch these little kids as I walked that reminded me of Little Village, playing with little paper boats in flooded gutters, making a dirty flooded gutter a wondrous thing. And I would just wonder, which one of you guys is going to write? Which one of you guys is going to be the Argyle writer? I know there's going to be one of you over there. I mean, actually, I mean, this is just the golden age of Asian American literature. It's just brilliant books and poems are coming out. So that thing that America can still do that, thank God. Maybe it's time to wrap it up. Thank you.
So that is formally the end of our program. Thank you so much, Stuart. My writer brain is percolating with lots of different thoughts right now. So I'm very grateful for everything you shared and for the thoughtful questions we had. So on behalf of the University Libraries, I want to thank everyone for attending. And before we formally close out, Dr. Gilmore would like to say a few words of thanks himself to Stuart and also to all of you. Thank you. Come on up, Peter. Feel free to stand here if you like.
Don't be afraid of what I'm going to say.
Oh, no.
I just
Not
told
bad.
I just told Stuart, don't be afraid of what I'm going to say. What an evening, what an evening. To the east of us, the coast of Chicago. To the west of us, streets in their own ink. Your memories of days gone by, your hopes for the future, your enchanting prose and poetry, inspirational. So wonderful to be in aesthetic cahoots with one of our famed alumni authors. So here's a package of appreciation from the Loyola Libraries. Thank you again, Stuart.